Good afternoon. I realise I am now the only thing standing between you and esports and beer. So I will try and take a seat as soon as I can and we can all get along to that. I will be sticking around as well. And a bit of shameless self-promotion. I actually opened up Australia's first dedicated esports bar, but in Melbourne last year. Queen Street, GG Easy, 93 basement. Get along if you're ever in town. And I also happen to play for one of Australia's premier teams, arguably the first internationally competitive team back in the early noughties. We were called Pantheon, and we were the first Australian team to travel over to Dallas in South Korea and play Counter-Strike and get paid for it. My parents were very concerned and made sure they came along to a couple of trips just to be sure it wasn't kind of some kind of entrapment. Since then, of course, I've been mainly in technology. Now, I know I was sort of introduced as a futurist, and everybody goes, the futurist, the fluffy guy who doesn't actually know shit. But I've actually been on the tools, working on technology as a technologist for a long time. I started cutting code when I was 13, went off to start my own business a few years later. I've worked at the AFL, spearheading some virtual reality initiatives with them. They really liked the idea that they could sell one seat digitally an infinite amount of times. Seemed like a good money spinner to them. I've worked in UX, establishing some capabilities for various businesses, including cloud solutions and IT consultancy in Melbourne. And most recently, I've been working on some IoT work for the trains here in Sydney. Also for Horizon State, my most recent startup, which has been focusing on blockchain. And so, while I want to cover off a few technology concepts here, really with the angle to try and help people think a little bit more out of the box and dream a little bit bigger, because it's probably worth noting that talking about what I talk about usually scares a lot of people. Probably not so much the people in this room, but the broader populace. Change and disruption, these aren't sort of concepts that really resonate. It's not the sort of thing that suburban and rural dwellers really want to hear about. And so a lot of my messaging is about the work I've done and how we can leverage technology to actually leverage that change, seize it, see it as opportunity, and make sure that we're making the best of it. And to try and really help people realize that we are in fact steering the future. We don't have to be passengers of it. So to illustrate, and keeping in mind, while we will focus a little bit on blockchain, I'll cover off another few other technologies. Now, these I've actually had no involvement in, as much as I would have loved to. That would have been pretty special. But the one on the right, I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Really, this heralded in the age of true democratization of information dissemination. The printing press was obviously a landmark technology. The idea that we would be able to publish information and spread it widely was really quite empowering. And it's through this sort of information evolution that we've been able to strip the shackles of biological evolution and generation on generation actually improve our society through this transfer of knowledge. And this device has been a revelation. The personal computer now fits into your pocket, of course. On the left, we have the steam engine. This was another foundational technology for modern civilization. It more than anything else changed the world in unexpected ways, and you'll probably see that as a bit of a theme in what we're talking through as well. It went on to change transport. It went on to change manufacturing. It really kickstarted the Industrial Revolution. The fear of robotics and automation is ultimately all because of this machine, once upon a time, the origin story. And then in the middle is one which is a little bit more obscure, but it's actually my favorite because it's a great representation of how well-designed technology can change society in incredibly unpredictable but potentially very positive ways as well. So the humble elevator, upon its introduction, really shifted the structure of society in urban centres. Before it, most buildings were 4-ish stories high. You just look over to London, even 50, 60 years ago to get some sort of feel about what that world looked like. And typically, the help actually lived on the top floor. They lived on the 4th because nobody really wants to be trekking up and down stairs every single day. And the wealthy, the opulent, lived on the ground floor. The elevator really changed that, and it introduced the concept of the high life, the origins of that saying. it meant that all of a sudden you could get up to the top very fast, of course, and this dramatically changed things for that cultural landscape. But it also brought cities in. It enabled us to start building really, really, really tall buildings, and thus these urban centres became more dense. This changed everything from business opportunity to the way we socialise. It also reduced our footprint geographically and environmentally on the rest of the planet. It's a little known fact that, in fact, if you live in a small apartment or even a small house in inner city Sydney or Melbourne, your impact on the environment is generally, according to data, quite a lot less than that fantasy of living out in the country. Because it's an economy of scales thing, right? If you're leaning on more products and services which already have to operate in this area, then ultimately things like logistics have far less of a footprint. So I want to start off with blockchain because I really feel like it's going to be one of those kinds of technologies. It's going to be a society-changing technology. It's going to be a behavior-changing technology. And it's also going to change the world in lots of unexpected ways. Now, Bitcoin is, of course, the first publicly used distributed ledger of this kind. Some really, really clever things in play, such as proof of work and other concepts which pull it all together and make it possible. Now, I'm sure nobody in this room conflates Bitcoin with blockchain because, of course, they are separate things. One is the enabler, and one is the thing that sits atop. We've got Bitcoin's blockchain with a capital B, and then we've got Bitcoin's currency with a lowercase b, which sits on top. It is the application, the killer app, decentralized currency. But conflation of blockchain and Bitcoin is actually a pretty common thing. And so a lot of what I talk about is first trying to make sure that people appreciate the difference. Hands up here if you haven't heard of Ethereum. A couple people. So I expect then that most of the room will already appreciate that there are already many, many blockchains with all kinds of digital assets with different kinds of purposes. Now, Ethereum, of course, really you're talking about a local ecosystem, economic unit designed to pay gas, to run code in the cloud across a distributed network, so to speak, yada, yada. And then we also have lots of other interesting blockchains which are trying to solve different problems using the same fundamental ideas. But a lot of people don't really recognize how it works simply in terms of it being trustworthy and secure. And again, I'm sure most of the audience here does, but what I find particularly useful at this point in time, especially with the markets in a particularly bare state, and obviously technology still a ways from mass adoption and I guess meaningful application within enterprise due to some of the scaling issues at hand, being able to explain it simply, some of the, I guess, the value propositions to everyday people is really, really helpful. So about a year and a half ago, I wrote an article on LinkedIn, which went viral. Initially, because I was being accused of ageist. It was titled, How to Explain Blockchain to Your Parents. And so I had this just army of middle-aged people, which I am now as well, by the way, flood my post and criticize me. But it ended up getting picked up by Business Insider. It got picked up by various finance publications around the world and in Australia. And it seemed to resonate. It ended up being viewed millions of times and shared hundreds of thousands. And the premise is this. If we want to think about a Bitcoin transaction as the example and how that's trustworthy and how it's secure, then we might want to think about two of us in the room wanting to exchange some value. Now, it doesn't have to be $5, Australian. It doesn't have to be $5 or currency in a sense. Let's just pretend that we wanted to exchange $5 worth of something, but we didn't want to use an intermediary. We can use a bank as an example, but any other kind of middleman for that transaction who we might have to pay significant fees to or would create additional lead time, these kinds of things. So instead what we tried to do in some kind of analog is gather up a group of trusted associates, could be everybody in this room, and we get them to bring along a notebook and a pen. Because keeping in mind, at its core, technologically, this is still just it's kind of a database. It's a record book. It's a ledger. And we get them to witness this transaction. So they see who it was from and who it's going to, and they record the location, and they record the time, and they make sure that the signatures are correct. And they all share this reality. They reach consensus amongst that group. And then they all go back home. Some of them live around the corner. Some of them live off in Melbourne. Some of them live overseas. Now, conceptually, while technically imperfect, as I'm sure everybody here would agree, conceptually, the idea to try and be a bad actor, to try and be a little bit nefarious and change this transaction would require you to break into more or less everybody's house instantaneously without waking them up and change that line item from 5 to 50 and hope that sort of nobody realizes. So obviously there's a lot more to it than that. But this kind of explanation, as technically imperfect as it is, tends to lead people down a rabbit hole. It inspires them and it gets them wanting to learn more about this technology and how it can impact them. Now in that article, I also gave some real-world use cases because a lot of people just think cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. Some people have heard of some novel use cases, maybe in finance or accounting, but in fact there's a lot more that you can do with this technology. So I'm going to run through a few of them with you, as I have done in quite a few recent talks, just to try and get people thinking a little bit more creatively about how what is ultimately a decentralized distributed ledger can be used for. So the first is media and music and entertainment. Now an obvious one here is in respect to licensing, but philosophically what we're talking about is the opportunity to, I guess, level the playing field between artist and publisher, to really try and create a much more direct relationship between that artist and the end user. So right now, I expect that most people in this room have probably moved on from MP3s, and you are using Spotify, or Google Music, or Apple Music, any one of the above, maybe another one, and you're paying $13 a month, or whatever it might be. Now, in reality, most of that money goes to that company. They have huge overheads, they have huge staff, they are often publicly held and thus need to appease shareholders by building up healthy bank balances. But what this technology enables is more of a peer-to-peer system for this kind of consumption. So you might have a foundation that maintains the interface, and behind that are users and artists. They can publish their music, others can stream it, and you might commit to the network $15 a month, or $13 a month, or $1 a month, whatever it might be. And then that is automatically sent off to the artist that you've listened to that month, almost in its entirety. And so if you only happen to listen to one Alanis Morissette song this month, and I hope that's not the case, but if you did, then all of your money would go to Alanis Morissette. She could probably use it now, actually. And I'm sure you can appreciate that this is a pretty profound thing. We're sort of moving the middleman, in this case to a foundational model, who isn't really taking any more than what's required to make sure that we are able to sort of create a greater equality in wealth generation, consumption and distribution. We also have file storage. So I'm sure that a lot of people here are familiar with Box and Dropbox and OneDrive, Google Drive. Again, similar sorts of situations where you pay a company X dollars per month to store your files in the cloud. Now, technically it's already decentralized, of course. If you go over to Europe, or you're traveling in the States, or you're over in Melbourne to come check out the esports bar, then what will happen is obviously you will typically be routed through a local data center and you'll get that file nice and fast if it doesn't happen to be stored locally. But it's still centralized in the sense that it's with one giant incumbent institution, such as Google or Dropbox or otherwise. And if you want to put on a privacy conscious hat, there are still, of course, concerns about who owns that data, who will ultimately have access, what happens if breaches occur, all this sorts of stuff. And using this technology, we have the opportunity to, again, move the middleman out of the picture. So there are numerous blockchain startups right now working on this. One of them is called Golem. Actually, Golem I'll mention again in just a moment. There's also Filecoin. There's a few. The premise here is that you, as individuals, can commit your hardware to the network. It could be a laptop, could be a Raspberry Pi with some storage attached, could be your desktop gaming PC. And you effectively charge people for disk space. It happens autonomously, automatically, fractions of a cent down to 18 decimal places. And we have, in effect, a way to be remunerated for giving up hard drive space which you weren't using anyway, for people that need it, who would rather not run through a middleman and have less of a privacy concern. And of course, the people that are uploading the files, this isn't about me sending Alanis Morissette's MP3 to one computer. Of course, it's broken up into bits and bytes, and each bit and byte is made redundant across many, many machines, many nodes on the network, many participants on the network, and only you have the private key to access that image as a whole and all this sort of stuff. There are also enterprise applications for this which are being developed right now as well. But again, what we're really talking about is the opportunity to create greater equality and move some of the wealth generation and the power vacuums that are starting to accumulate with these enormous tech behemoths. We also have peer-to-peer energy trade thanks to this technology. If we think about at a ledger level, at a distributed database level, what this enables, beyond the trust described earlier, is indeed things like 18 decimal places. And it's things like instant settlement, which even when you tap your card on something is not so instant. The real settlement happens hours or sometimes days or weeks behind the scenes, but you have been identified and there is an IOU in place. This is legitimately, virtually instantaneously settled, and it's at fractions of a cent. The Ethereum network isn't under particularly high load at the moment. You can transfer whatever amount of Ethereum you like for literally fractions of a cent, and there are scaling solutions in place that will increase that further. And what this does is mean that all of a sudden we can think about concepts such as getting off the grid, which some of you have maybe already thought about given the developments in solar technology, looking at Elon Musk's roof tiles and his battery wall. But what this enables is then, instead of just, using the sun for your own resource and maybe not needing to pay Origin Energy or Energy Australia so much this time, instead you'll be able to trade that energy with neighbours. And so your little computers will talk to your neighbours. Some of them may have excess, some of them may need extra. And micro trades will happen automatically, trading the kilowatt hours, or because of the granularity of many of these cryptographic assets, far less than a typical kilowatt hour. We can change that measurement and we can start thinking about megajoules or even joules and the trading of tiny increments of energy based on consumption. And then we have my latest project called Horizon State. And we leverage the technology for something a little bit more abstract. It's not really financial in nature at all, which I guess when you boil it down, those other examples, is still about utilizing this technology for improved economic use cases, for improving finance and the transmission of currency, of value, the internet of value, the internet of money, as they say. And instead, we were retrofitting these transactions on a blockchain. It could be the Bitcoin blockchain. It actually didn't matter. Completely agnostic. Could be Ethereum, which we've used. Could be Dash. Could be NEM. And it would retrofit these transactions to represent a vote. And this is a really, really powerful idea because if we think about the developing nations where election fraud, unfortunately, is relatively common, then using this technology, we have the opportunity to create a record of the result which is tamper-proof. It's unhackable. It's perfectly transparent. It's perfectly auditable. So a huge value proposition for the developing world. Of course, if we can start people voting on their phones or from shared computers at libraries or community centres, then we can also get them away from the polling stations, where in developing nations, very often there are, unfortunately, life-threatening risks in doing so. In terms of developed nations like Australia and the United States, and a European nation where this will likely be piloted in just a short few months, there is the opportunity to reduce costs greatly. And this isn't even necessarily about electoral processes. If we think about non-binding votes, such as the recent plebiscite on same-sex marriage, that cost us as taxpayers $120 million. It's absurd. That works out to be $7 or $8 per eligible voter. And so using this technology, not only can we improve security infinitely using this underlying technology, whereas with the plebiscite we saw votes left out in the rain and sent to the wrong addresses, but we can cut that cost down to about $1 million for the entire nation as opposed to $120 million. We can also count it immediately and run that process in a few days or a few weeks instead of a few months. So really, really powerful stuff that's doing good, I suppose. It's not just about economies, it's not just about finance. This technology really does have the opportunity to change things in some pretty amazing ways. Some other really great use cases, supply chain, curbing the flow of blood diamonds and conflict diamonds. By being able to fingerprint a diamond at the side of mine, and then have that trackable through the entire supply chain to the consumer where they buy it, and be confident that the record of that flow with the fingerprint of the diamond is perfect. Nobody has had the opportunity to insert any nefarious data. Nobody has had the opportunity to go back and change any of the previous transactions. You know that this is legitimately coming from a certain place, a certain company, and you can assess how they treat their workers. You can assess humanitarian conditions and think about really making better purchase decisions as a consumer. The United Nations recently biometrically scanning Syrian refugees in Jordanian camps and assigning cryptographic assets to them as food stamps to use in stores within those camps. So this obviously runs a far lower risk of any opportunity for counterfeiting, but also mitigates any opportunity for theft and violence within those camps. Over in Africa, a country that unfortunately hasn't been able to do a lot of business with the rest of the world because of prohibitive fees on getting money in and out, Western Union and the like, they can now look to these cryptographic assets to do business with the rest of the world far more effectively and cheaply, and finally become a part of the world's economy, which is really, really exciting. Now, philosophically, before I get on to this next little piece of the futurist puzzle, I suppose, about unpredictable outcomes and some of the other amazing technologies which will shape our near future, I think I really wanted to point out that while there's a lot of focus on the crypto asset market at the moment, and the fact it's slumped, it's down 90% a year ago, and to be honest, I have no care about the market specifically, but this tends to put a bit of a doom and gloom picture on this technology. I think personally, what it matters is little, and it is so far from the truth in the sense that the technology has already proven its value through some of the use cases that I've just described, and it will only get more powerful as they mature. But really, it's also of great benefit to us, even outside of those situations where it is most valuable in the developing nations. And the reason I say this, and it's an example that I've talked about very often recently in the press and at other talks, is that as Australians, we are world leaders in digital transactions. About 70% of the transactions made in this country every single day are digital. They're not with cash anymore, which is staggeringly large and a good margin above any other country in the world. Now, as we head towards this world of pure digital commerce, ultimately what this means is the opportunity for a surveillance nation to unfold. And without trying to sound too much like a tinfoil hat wearing individual, I do want to point out that the ability for free trade is really a kind of basic liberty. The opportunity for you and me to exchange value is a basic liberty. And there are laws being imposed in the very near future which restrict this liberty, such as from next year, the idea that we will not be able to transact $10,000 unless it is digital. It will be illegal for a merchant to accept $10,000 in cash or any other kind of medium of exchange, which isn't necessarily something any of us would do on a day-to-day basis, except if you're at some fancy coffee shops in Melbourne. But the point stands that this opportunity shouldn't be eradicated. Free exchange is as important as free speech. In fact, I'd argue that free exchange is, in effect, a kind of speech, and it shouldn't be censored in any way, shape, or form. And so I believe that cryptocurrency, these cryptographic assets, have really come just in time. It's kind of the new cash. It's a digital cash where we can maintain some of that self-sovereign financial liberty, but do so with a whole lot of extra conveniences. Borderless, low transactions, instant settlement, all these kinds of things. Really cool. Now, I mentioned earlier some of the other work I've been involved in, and I also mentioned VR. I'm going to get to that in just a second. But very quickly, I want to run you guys through, I guess, some of the more unpredictable eventuations that some of these emerging technologies are set to unleash. Because typically, it's been the unpredictable outcomes of technologies that have actually been the most meaningful. I'll give you a couple examples very shortly to illustrate that point. But driverless cars are on the way. Unfortunately, progress has slowed over the last 12 months or so, but before that it really was breakneck speed kind of stuff. 1 month people were coming out and saying Driverless cars will never be able to operate in bad weather conditions such as snow. And then a month later, LiDAR arrived and snow was invisible. And so huge amounts of progress being made, but of course, this is so much more than just giving us some more time to watch YouTube or read a book or work more and be even more productive, despite all these amazing technologies doing that for us. This is going to impact industry and government and individual far and wide. And I want to pose a few ideas for you to start thinking about, and the ramifications that it may have or might not have on us collectively. One is the fact that these cars, when implemented properly, will never drink drive and they'll never speed. So of course, the idea that we're going to reduce human casualties and fatalities on the road is the most important part of this equation. But as a byproduct of doing that, the government suddenly loses a big stream of revenue because nobody's being fined for running red lights, nobody's being fined for speeding, and all of a sudden that money dries up, it disappears. And unfortunately that money is really, really important. And so the question is, then where do we get that money from? If we think about insurers, if all of a sudden your personally owned vehicle has an incredibly low chance of ever being involved in a crash of your causing, then what happens to your premiums? Do they even exist? What happens to the world of insurance? If these cars don't need drivers, then we could have an Uber in the not so distant future that obviously doesn't have a driver, and thus it brings Uber down to the cost of public transport. And so for the same cost as catching the bus into town, you could have a private vehicle autonomously arrive at your doorstep and whisk you away. And so what happens to the public transport networks and the incredible public transport infrastructure that we're building right now in major cities such as Sydney? So there are really far-reaching implications for all of this technology, which as technologists, we have to be conscious of and think deeply about as well. Because of course, the whole point of this talk is that we're designing the future consciously, but also there is an unconscious element, which I think it would do us all a lot of good to pay a little bit more attention to. We have virtual reality. Now obviously, media is a clear example. I'm a gamer myself, and so the idea that I'll be playing a first-person shooter in the not-too-distant future with some additional sensory inputs and it'll feel like I'm there is really cool. And selling seats an infinite amount of times at the AFL is really cool to them. But this is kind of like the final platform. Once a virtual experience is good enough to emulate the real world in some fashion, even if in a very isolated environment compared to the enormous geography of planet Earth, then we have the opportunity to simulate inside of the simulation. And for those of you that are familiar with Nick Bostrom's simulations theory, then you'll see where I'm going with this. But it's really, really exciting for the future. In the nearer term, still the future, but much nearer term, I really feel like this is something we consider the ultimate empathy machine. And so I've been encouraging people working in this space to much more frequently be thinking about the ways that this particular technology can be used for good to improve society and societal cohesion. And one of those use cases, being an empathy machine, is the opportunity to let people live in the shoes of others, to have them experience moments of somebody else's life, to garner an appreciation for their experiences and their difficulties and the problems that they may be facing. And so if you imagine that you're able to live an hour in the shoes of a Syrian refugee, or live an hour in the shoes of somebody less fortunate than you or a minority of any case, then what we have here is a tool that can ultimately help work towards the eradication of discrimination of many kinds, be it sexism or racism, discrimination against refugees. When you start to understand what it's like to be those people, really feeling like you're there and that you're them, then this is an incredibly profound and positive influence. And then thinking a little bit more abstract is BCI, brain to computer interface. So this technology is already real, but it's really in its earliest incarnations. Facebook are currently playing around with letting you sort of type really fast, basically, using your brainwaves, and of course capture all that information and give it to the NSA. But where we're going to be going with this technology sooner or later is the idea that we will suddenly have a communication medium of higher bandwidth than any of us have ever experienced in the history of mankind. We'll have the opportunity to not transmit ideas in language like I'm doing now, which is incredibly narrow bandwidth. I have a tone and an inflection. I have a native local language, but it takes a really long time to say all this. What if in moments I could transmit these ideas, the entire content of this thought to you in a fraction of a second? What if I could convey my exact emotion to you in a fraction of a second for you to know exactly how I feel and not just what I'm saying? Really, really profound. Again, it's going to be exciting, really exciting. Now, in terms of the unexpected eventuations, I thought these examples were good ones to try and have everybody think a little bit more deeply about what I meant precisely by that. Now, the middle one, Thomas Edison's invention, the phonograph, was really about recording human spoken audio, but he didn't necessarily know what to do with it. And there are a few inventions like this over time where there either has been a loose, deliberate reason for its invention, or it's just an inventor, someone experimenting, trying to accomplish something because we can. This is kind of one of those. He thought that the best use for this incredible invention was going to be the recording of eulogies so that family members can listen to the eulogies of their recently deceased over and over again. It's pretty morbid, actually, isn't it? But it's gone on to revolutionize literally the entire world. This was the inception for everything, this microphone, the smartphone in your pockets. It's amazing. The idea that we can record the vibrations creating sounds around us and keep them for all perpetuity and play them back. Before recorded audio, there was only live music. And so it's quite phenomenal to start thinking about all those knock-on effects and how this technology has improved the world, changed the world, created communication mediums of different bandwidths to enrich the way we think and the way we communicate and the way we interact. Over on the left, the light bulb, we all take it for granted now. But the light bulb very specifically, or light, artificial light, outside of electricity per se, thinking back to, lighting candles of pig fat. This was once incredibly expensive. Hundreds and thousands of years ago, this would take more or less more effort to create than it would yield benefit, especially before the printing press. And then beyond that, for the poor, it would take hours at best, but usually days or weeks or sometimes months of work to pay for a single hour of artificial light. Now, as this became more affordable, this wasn't just about lighting the streets and it's like, hey, this is nighttime, I can see you now, how cool is that? It's novel, cool. But through having additional hours of light, we're able to make ourselves more knowledgeable. We're able to socialize more, read books, exchange those ideas. And so it really helped us accelerate this amazing evolution of knowledge and information dissemination. And it's really part of the reason that we are where we are today. I guess why we've seen so much incredible progress. Most recently, Uber arrived, illegally, of course, initially. But I think sometimes asking for forgiveness is better than asking for permission. And what I find most interesting about the Uber case really has nothing to do with regulation or, in fact, the technical use case or the disruption of the taxi industry. It's about the unexpected behavior change. There was really a gamble here that people would even use it. Because 15 years ago, the idea that you would hop into a stranger's car who isn't a licensed driver and be whisked away somewhere would seem quite insane. In the same way that inviting someone from the other side of the world to stay in your house who you've never met and you've just seen a photo of them, Airbnb, seems insane. But these technologies have changed the way that society organizes itself. They've changed our behavior and they've changed our expectation for the behavior of others. And they've done so in generally a very positive way. Which leads me to the final point, which I hope is what most of us are ultimately working towards in one way, shape or form, which is overall the improvement of the world. When we're working on technology that reduces harm, when we're working on technology that enables greater efficiency for knowledge consumption, we are doing great things for global progress. And now some of them are obviously more, bigger than others. But this is a great representation of, in fact, some of the technologies that we've just talked about. It's a representation of the progress we've seen in medical science and the progress that we've benefited from using the scientific method to advance that. There's a common misconception. In fact, 9 out of 10 people polled today will tell you that generally, to the question, is the world getting better or worse? 9 out of 10 people today will tell you that the world is getting worse. But objective reality is that it's completely the opposite. We live in the best time that has ever been because of our technological progress. These are just some of the stats, of course, but ultimately there is less terrorism now than ever before in history. We have the lowest rates of child mortality than ever before in history. We are at record lows for extreme poverty. It's actually pretty marvelous. But because of the 24/7 news cycle, or 24/7 fear cycle, as I like to call it, our judgment becomes obfuscated. If anybody wants to learn more about this kind of data and the technologies that enable these kinds of improvements, then head to ourworldindata.org. It's a tremendous resource. And I think it's really, really, really important as technologists to remember that we have been net gaining so far, and in doing so in incredible fashion. This isn't just about progress in superficial ways while we leave the rest of the world behind. In fact, the world's developing nations are far better off than they've ever been before, and they're racing ahead of us right now. The middle class in developed nations has slumped now for a generation or two in terms of prosperity, but we've lifted the rest of the world out of that situation thanks to globalization and thanks to technology. So remember that things are getting better, and that through paying attention to your conscious and unconscious decisions as we're building the next generation of technology, that we are in fact designing our future, and that we can really contribute and play a meaningful role in making the world even better. Thank you.